Greetings all and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we'll be finishing off my Airfix Fw190 build with a little bit of weathering and adding these smaller parts. So without further ado, let's finish off this kit. With all of the airbrush painting completed, I removed the retracted landing gear parts which I'd used as a mask and began to cut out the actual landing gear parts, headrest and the propeller. I then sanded the parts with a metal and nail file to remove the seam lines and any excess sprue. The prop was then glued to the cowling fan, followed by the spinner, and after some light sanding, I attached the tail wheel. One criticism of this kit I've heard is that the landing gear struts are moulded extended as if there was no weight on the aircraft, so since my FW would be bombed up, I decided to attempt cutting a segment out and then gluing them in place slightly more compressed. But I found that they were very fragile, and since the F8 I was doing had the bottom part of the wheel covers removed to prevent mud and snow from jamming up the wheels, they weren't really there to support the struts. As a result, I decided to instead use some spares from another kit so that they weren't so delicate and just leave them in the extended position. I then glued the wheels and modified landing gear doors to each strut and added them onto the wings. Once they're in place, I added the smaller struts which are inside the wheel wells and added the step ladder for the pilot in the extended position. The pesky cannon barrels and a replacement pitot tube were glued back onto the wings, and after some sanding, the main bomb was glued to the center rack, and the 4 smaller bombs were added to the outer wings. To paint these added parts and details, I switched back to brush painting and painted the propeller and bombs with AK Interactive's RLM70, the tail wheel, main wheels and cooling fan with Vallejo model colour flat black, and then applied several coats of these different colours to make them nice and solid. For the landing gear struts and tail wheels, I used Vallejo Model Air RLM02, although this being an airbrush paint is very thin, so I am considering getting Vallejo Model Colour RLM2. And for the outside of the landing gear doors and the step ladder, I applied a few coats of AK RLM76 Variation 1, which I'd used on the underside of the aircraft. After a few more touch-ups of these colours, I then painted the cannon and machine gun barrels with Vallejo Model Air Gunmetal Metallic. The hub of the tail wheel was very carefully painted with Vallejo Model Air Aluminium, and then I very carefully painted the white spiral on the propeller. Although a decal is included for the spiral, I always find it easier to paint them on with German aircraft. Any mistakes on the tail wheel were then fixed up with some flat black, and RLM70 was used to touch up the propeller spiral before I finished the white again with another coat, and finally sprayed the model in a coat of matte varnish to protect the winter camo, finer details and the decals. I used 2 drops of flow improver, 5 drops of thinners and 5 drops of matte varnish, which seemed to work quite well applied in a few light passes. The matte varnish blended and protected the layers very nicely, but took away the shine of the gunmetal on the cannons, so I had to apply another coat. I also used the gunmetal to paint the exhaust heat shields on the sides of the fuselage. To paint the nav lights and the bare metal parts on the wheel struts, I used Vallejo Model Air RLM01 Silver, and to add some subtle metal chipping to the propeller blades and wheel hubs, I dry brushed a bit of the Vallejo Model Air Aluminium. I finally unmasked the canopy and found the liquid and Tamiya masks worked perfectly, although I still did find a tiny bit of cleanup on the edges was necessary using a cocktail stick. I painted the headrest with several coats of RLM66 grey, and then the glare shield and the tiny gun sight with some model colour flat black. To paint the padding that's on the gun sight and the trim on the glare shield, I used a tiny bit of Vallejo model colour saddle brown, applied in 2 layers, and then I picked out the reflector sight with RLM01 silver. Satisfied with the paint on the gun sight, I then cut it out carefully using a knife and attempted to glue it to the glare shield, only to find it didn't really fit, as it was supposed to be installed before the fuselage halves were joined. I did manage to get it into place eventually, but it took a little bit of cutting down. To give the wheel hubs a gloss finish on the centre, I applied some gloss varnish using a fine brush, and then used flat black to touch up the glare shield and paint the headrest. After the warning decal on the back of the headrest had been applied, I then carefully glued it to the main canopy section. The front windshield was then sanded down slightly so that it would fit, and then I carefully applied some Revell Contactor Professional to the base and glued it to the glare shield. Usually though I'd use some rocket odorless CA glue, but at the time I was out. A little bit of vermilion red was used to apply the markings to the stepladder, and also some small marks on the wheels based on reference photos, before I then moved on to adding some more weathering. First of all, to add some grime effects as well as highlight the details and create a post-shading effect, I used some Tamiya black panel accent, applying it over the various recessed panel lines, especially around the engine, the control surfaces, on the underside of the wings, and very heavily on and around the landing gear, which often get dirty and leak a little bit of oil. To add some variety, I mixed in some brown panel line accent, especially around the wheels and upper surface, to simulate a little bit of dirt, and around the underside engine to add some variation from various oil stains. The effect is pretty strong, so to remove the excess, help the panel liner flow more into just the gaps, and also create a subtle streaking effect, I use a cotton bud dipped in some X20 enamel thinners to drag away the excess panel liner. In some tighter areas I would use a fine brush as required. I continued to work away the excess wash until I'd created a more subtle appearance that I was happy with. For some of the heavier effects, I use some of Tamiya's water-activated weathering powders. I apply the black pigment heavily around the exhausts and streak it backwards based on reference photos, and as the pigments dry, I remove the excess and soften the edges of the exhaust streaking using a damp brush dipped in some water to rub away the excess. Black pigments were also applied streaking backwards around the wheel well, the control hinges, ejector ports for the shell casings, the muzzles, and the cowling for some oil streaks, grime, and gun smoke. I decided to experiment by using the white pigments to create a build-up of snow effect by applying it into the ruts of the wheels, and finally to add some dried dirt and mud splatters on the sides of the aircraft from it operating out of dirt strips. I dabbed some of the rust-coloured pigment onto the wheels, landing gear doors, the ladder, walkway, the base of the rudder near the tail wheel, and on the underside of the wings. Once again, water could then be used to streak and remove the excess after it had been applied. I also had some Vallejo environment snow effects, so I decided to apply a bit to add some extra snow build-up on the wheels, as if a small amount had built up on them. I probably should have double checked reference photos at the time, but it was quite a fun technique and I was quite happy with how it looked. On pretty much all of my aircraft, I like to have the option to add or remove a pilot, so I used blue tack to hold the canopy in place instead of gluing it, and once it was in position, I created the rigging wire by using AK Interactive's ultra-thin rigging wire and some super glue. I glued the wire first to the canopy, then stretched it back, glued it to the tail, cut away the excess rigging wire, and then added the smaller line from the tail to the fuselage sides. By this stage, the silver had dried on the Nav Lights, so I then added their colour using some Tamiya clear red for the left side and clear green for the right one. And finally, after painting the control tabs on the aircraft with vermilion red, my Airfix Fw190 F8 was finally completed. And here you can see the results I achieved with this model. So I think it's safe to say over the years my Fw190 builds have been steadily improving, and I have to say I'm very happy with how this one turned out. It has definitely been a learning experience with this one, especially using the airbrush for the first time to do a German and a winter camouflage scheme, but also a lot of fun, and I think it went really well. A few people have already been sharing some great advice for how I can improve my airbrushing techniques, which is really appreciated. In my Tamiya and Edgeward 190 builds I'm currently working on, I've already started to adjust how I've applied the base colours, and I've also done some further experimenting using aluminium as a base colour rather than just applying the camouflage over the gloss black. And I've also adjusted how I've been masking off the yellow markings on the underside of the aircraft and the fuselage bands more effectively. In the future, I'm planning on doing a winter diorama base and also painting the pilot figure included in this kit, so if you guys want to see that as a future video, definitely let me know in the comments. The Airfix 190 has a couple of fiddly steps and some fit issues and parts that require some sanding, especially around the cowling, but in my opinion it's still a pretty easy, accurate and enjoyable build with some nice details. I've built it a few times over the years, and it being the first World War II single-engine prop kit I ever built makes it a bit of a nostalgic one for me. So admittedly, I am probably a bit biased, and I apologise to all those who started out their modelling careers on Spitfires. Although the Edgeward kit is definitely more detailed and has a lot more options for marking and variants, and I will be covering that in a future build video, I would still recommend having a build of this Airfix one, especially if you're a beginner or just want a simpler 190 build in 1/72nd scale. Just make sure you spend some time sanding the cowling parts, do a little bit of test fitting, and you should have a good time with this kit. So that wraps up my series on revisiting the Airfix 190 I built as a kid in the form of the 2019 re-release, and the very first time I've attempted a German winter camouflage with an airbrush. I hope you guys have enjoyed following along with this series, and thank you very much for all of the advice and feedback that you've already left in the previous videos. Coming up next, I'll be building the Tamiya and the Edgeward Fw190s in 1/72nd scale, and finally starting some animation work this week, hopefully, so stay tuned for those videos in the future. If you'd like to support my channel and help me keep these build videos, inbox reviews, and animations coming, then please consider liking and subscribing. A massive thank you to my wonderful patrons for helping me to not only fund buying this kit and the supplies I've used, but also helping me in finally getting an airbrush setup. If you'd like to join my Patreon, I'll leave a link in the description. Top tier members get early ad-free access to my videos, discounts on my 3D designs on Colts, exclusive content, and extra voting power on my future builds and projects. Thanks again for watching, and until the next video, as always, take care and model on.